Okay. You're here joining me in person as well as those that are at home or wherever you are live streaming. You're telling me that you want to learn more about grief. You're telling me that you want to engage with your grief experience. And I respect that because this is not an easy journey. It's a very normal journey, but it's not an easy journey. And we'll get a little bit more into that as why it's not an easy journey because of the society we live in. But this is actually what you're going through outside of wanting to harm yourself or anyone else. This is a normal, natural process, and it does not last forever. It might feel like that, but it doesn't. So we've got a smaller group tonight. We're going to try and be informal. I do have information that I want to share. And I'll stop every so often to ask if you've got questions, but at any point in time, please feel free to let me know if you've got any questions. And then I'll check in about halfway to see whether or not you want a stretch break, and we'll do that, okay? So tonight we're going to talk about why do we need self-care in grief? And when we get into what grief does to you, how it affects our minds, our heads, our bodies, and our souls, and how it can be overwhelming at times, I hope you leave understanding the need to look after ourselves. As John said, we're always concerned about everyone else. And this is what I find with my clients, that they don't allow the process to unfold naturally the way it should because they're concerned about other people and making other people sad or putting other people off. And there is a way that you can be kind to other people, but mostly to be kind to yourself, because you are the only one walking this journey, with the exception of other loved ones who are also hurting as a result of the death of the person you're here. But if you're concerned about somebody else who isn't related or isn't affected, your job is really to look after yourself first. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how grief affects us and the different ways that we can then look after ourselves. Now, it's not uncommon that we confuse self-care with selfishness. And that's furthest from the truth. Because if we don't put ourselves first, who is going to? Okay? So keep that in mind as we move forward. This is going to be a very general presentation. I don't know who's in my audience. I don't know your stories. And each one of your stories are different, just like your fingerprints, right? There might be several spousal loss in here, but each of your stories are going to be different. Maybe you've lost a parent, a child, a significant other, a friend. But each of your stories are going to be different. So I can't speak specifically. So if there's anything beyond the scope of this presentation that you think you might need to chat about, book an appointment with me or come in and chat with me, okay? So before we get started, I want you to check in with your internal landscape, okay? What are you feeling right now? Where are you? So settle in your chair for a moment. If you want to close your eyes, go ahead and do that. And I just want you to go internally. How are you feeling? Was it difficult for you to come here tonight? Could you think of reasons why you could go somewhere else instead? Right? Were you fighting it? Did you come here willingly that you want to know more about grief and how to look after yourself? Is your heart racing? Are you calm? How are you breathing right now? Are you sad? Are you confused? Are you excited to find out more about grief? Whatever it is you're feeling, it's okay. So we're not going to judge ourselves, especially for this next hour and a bit. You're gonna allow whatever you feel during this time together to come up to the surface. Be okay with it. And what I'd like you to do as you move forward in your grief is do this check-in every so often. Okay? Where am I? If I'm feeling upset or dysregulated, it's just for this moment. I can get through this moment. Okay, so take a deep breath and we'll get started. Now, you'd all agree that we experience stress daily. From getting to work late, having a flat tire, losing your keys, all the way to illness and perhaps the death of a loved one. So what I'm describing are really external sources, right? But what's also really important is how we internally respond to that stress. So I may not get uptight when I lose my keys, because to me, maybe it's very common. But maybe to someone else, they get very stressed. Happens to you, it's how you interpret it as well. So a stressor then is an external stimulus, something in the environment that has Does a flat tire cause you stress? Or are you just going to go about and call CAA? Did you know that there's two forms of stress? There's eustress, that's actually considered very normal. We experience it every day. I had some eustress before coming to this presentation, and I've been presenting for 20 years, over 20 years. But this kind of stress or anxiety motivates me. It helps me to prepare. I can't just turn up here and put on a presentation. I need to prepare. But it's normal stress. It's usually short term, and we usually perceive that we have some sort of control over it. Sometimes it feels exciting, like a roller coaster ride. Not for me. That would be de-stress for me. Wouldn't be eustress. And it improves performance, getting ready for a job interview. Because we feel prepared. We feel like we're in control. Distress, on the other hand, is when we don't perceive we're in control or we have the tools to deal with what we're facing. This causes anxiety to rise more than it should or needs to. It's usually perceived outside of our coping strategies. It usually decreases performance. It could immobilize us. And on a long-term basis, it definitely affects our mental and our physical health. So, what stress does, it triggers these things in our system. Nod your head if you've heard of fight or flight or freeze. There's even another one called fawn. But we're going to concentrate on fight or flight. We all have that ability, all humans. It's automatic, it's protective, it's helped us to survive as mankind. In primitive days, it helped to protect the tribe from saber-toothed tigers, an oncoming, the villagers. They were always scanning the landscape, right? Have you heard of the term watchman, night watchman? That's where it comes from. There was always one person that stayed awake, watching for threats And it's an automatic response. It starts very deep in the limbic brain, in the emotional brain. We don't have control over it. My stress response is activated when I see a snake. Automatically. Because I don't like them. Now, if I happen to see a coiled garden hose out of the corner of my eye and I jump, that's also my stress response, but that's my stress response that's maybe a little overactive. Because our emotional brain, or the amygdala, where it all starts from, doesn't give it any context. It's very general. So if you've been bitten by a dog, and you hear a dog barking, but the dog is chained up and behind a fence, you're still going to have a startled response. And that's a way to protect you. But with the fight or flight response, we are meant to expel this energy, right? That's why your heart beats, your heart races. You start breathing shallow. You're getting ready physically to fight or to flee. You may vomit. You may defecate. That's because the body doesn't need any extra weight if you're going to run. Does that make sense? And yet, we take it very personally if that happens to us. But it's a very normal reaction. The body's preparing you to protect yourself. But as I said, stress should be acute. This is called the acute stress response. And then we should be able to expel it or do something about it and then regain our balance or homeostasis, right? After I nearly get hit by the car and I'm sitting on the sidewalk, I take some deep breaths and then I think, what just happened? And then I take stock. So my stress has been released, expressed, and I go back to homeostasis. So that's what we want to see. However, when we're in a situation where we believe that we can't cope, or that it's ongoing, as in the case of childhood trauma, right? Pervasive, ongoing, long-term childhood trauma. That's why we know, research tells us, that childhood trauma has far more consequences and impact than a one-time trauma in adulthood. Because the child doesn't have a way to release that stress, doesn't have an opportunity to flee. But if we perceive as adults that we're in a situation that we have no control or we don't have coping strategies, we then experience distress. Now, don't get me wrong, in grief, that's very different than being sad. Any questions so far? And so obviously you'd have to agree that the death of a loved one is a major stressor. It's a normal part of living, but it's a major stressor in our lives. We are not prepared for it. Whether the death was sudden, even if the death was, you knew the death was coming, even if you were by the side of your loved one. Our hearts are not prepared for it. Yes, we have a question? Up. Okay, louder. Thank you. The death of a loved one, actually the death of a spouse specifically, is rated the highest on this very well-known Holmes-Rahe stress scale. So your stress, if that's what your experience is very normal. So what are we talking about when we're talking about grief? It is how you feel on the inside. when someone that you love has died. It affects our heads, it affects our bodies, it affects our souls, it affects our relationships. Technically, we experience grief when we're separated or we cannot achieve anything that we want. So, I've lost a job, or my child has just moved away. That's a form of grief. But we're going to use grief specifically tonight in terms of death. So when we're separated from anybody or anything that's of value to us, we're going to have some response. And what that does, without you realizing it, could create a sense of threat. It could come in the form of anxiety, or panic, or fear. We usually associate sadness and yearning and crying to grief, but there's a whole body of knowledge out there that says anxiety is right up there, because somehow the world doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel safe. Now remember, this is all coming from your emotional brain. And the emotional brain was developed before our thinking brain. So this is good. Our feelings come before our thoughts. And you're here because you love. You loved. You were loved. That's not a thought. That's a feeling. That's an emotion. So death of a loved one has the potential to elicit this fight or flight response. With me so far? Okay? All right. So let's look at, unfortunately, what we're really good in this society of doing when we're going through the grief process. We engage in flight behaviors. I see some nodding. Anyone brave enough to share personal experience? No? How you doing? I'm keeping busy. I'm doing good. I'm keeping busy. Right? I'm keeping busy. We tell you to do that. We tell you to go back to work. We tell you to have another baby. If that's the case, you know. I told you everyone was different here. We tell you we've got somebody great we'd like you to meet. We tell you to move. We tell you to take down the pictures. We tell you to give away their belongings. And you'll feel better. But I'll tell you, if you move, you take yourself with you. You take your memories with you. There is no outrunning grief. I had a gentleman come to me in one of my sessions some time ago. And he came in with 6 other adults that I found out later would to be his adult children and their partners. And he came up to me at break time, and he had a problem with this one right here, rushing into a new relationship. And he says, what do you mean about? And I said, I understand it. I said, but if you haven't done your grief work, you're never ever going to be settled, and you're never really going to be able to give fully to this new relationship. And of course, I suspected that his spouse had died, and his spouse had died, and guess what? He had started to see somebody new. Now, I'm not big into timelines, but let's just say it was within 6 months. So then I wondered what he was doing at the grief presentation. I said, who are you here with? And he says, my kids. And I said, what do your kids think about this? They were all adults. And guess what? They didn't know anything about it. I said, I don't tell my clients what to do. I tell them what to look out for and not to go down certain paths. And I understand the urgency to move away from pain. I understand the urgency to fill in that space. But again, we're not thinking. We're feeling because we're fleeing. We want to flee the pain. And while that's very normal, generally speaking, you've earned this pain. You've earned this pain because you were in a love relationship. So we're very ill-prepared to deal with pain. We're taught about acquiring things, holding on to things, foreverness. We never ever think about the fact that nothing is really ours. Nothing is really ours. It's just borrowed. And so this automatically, the flight reaction kicks in. Except we're not in danger. There's no saber-toothed tiger. The bear from the woods isn't following you home. You're not in danger. So what are we afraid of? We're afraid of the pain. But there is a way to get through it. Any questions about this? Do you see how these are avoiding behaviors? Not wanting to feel the pain because it's just too painful. So, grief is very different than mourning. That's so true. We medicate ourselves. Even work. And we value work in this society, don't we? It's all about being productive and keeping busy. You come back to work yet? And so maybe for those 8 hours or 12 hours, you can compartmentalize and you do a good job. And then guess what happens as soon as you get in the car? Has anyone experienced that? Yeah. Have you wondered how you did so well for 8 hours and why as soon as you got into the car, it started tearing up?
Yeah, it's like I don't know what you want me to share. But
Sure, you go ahead, sure, definitely.
My husband passed away 8 weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
Unexpectedly, he had an abdominal aneurysm that ruptured. We didn't know he had. And I went back to work 10 days later.
10 days later?
10 days. Because I just found, we have 2 grown children in their 20s that still live at home, but he wasn't there, and I just found that they are mourning their dad, I'm mourning my husband of 30 years, but they have significant others and people to go to, and it's just me. And I went back to work, and it just feels like as soon as I get to work, I shut everything off, and I work, or I'll stay late at work. But when I leave work every day, that's when I'll start to cry or I'll feel sad, because that would be a time for me too, where
you and him.
I call him and connect,
That's right.
and that's not there. Or before I go to bed.
That's right.
At night.
What's your name? Do you mind?
Yes, Stephanie.
Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing. Should I repeat it for our people at home? They can hear it? Okay. So Stephanie, I should say that going back to work isn't necessarily a bad thing if we carve out time for our morning. Okay? Because the brain is a wonderful thing in terms of it will trick us into believing if I don't cry or think about my loved one for 6 hours or 8 hours, then I must be doing something right and I want it to continue. So if you did not allow yourself to cry and express your pain in the car, or feel sad, which you should be feeling right now, then you're engaging in continuing and mourning avoiding behaviors. So again, when clients come to me and they're not sure whether to return back to work, a lot depends on what they do, how their grief they're experiencing their grief. If I've got someone who doesn't sleep and has got a high-risk job and they can't focus, I'm not necessarily going to recommend that they go back to work. So it's very, very unique. So thank you for sharing. So although getting into the car and going home is going to remind you, because then you associate it with your husband and he's not there, it sounds like you're allowing yourself to feel that pain.
Kind of scared to be alone too, because if it's a day off, I don't want to get out of bed. Like, so I need to have a purpose to get up and I feel like to do something.
Yep. And there are going to be days that you don't want to get out of bed. And if you don't want to get out of bed, that's okay. Just make sure you get out of bed the next day. So grief is very much like this. Okay? Life, pay attention to my grief. Life, pay attention to my grief. We don't want to run away from our grief, because our grief is going to follow us. And we don't want to be in our grief totally, because that leads to mental health issues. And I'm not asking you to be motivated to engage in life. I'm just saying you need to keep putting one foot forward. Coming here. Now you shared with us you're 8 weeks into this grief process. I know some other people who have had a recent loss. Getting up, taking a breath, putting one foot in front of the other, putting on your clothes and coming here tonight is engaging in life. So don't discount that. Okay? I'll share another story. One of my long-term volunteers, when I used to run support groups, she came to me about a year and a half after her husband died. And she said, okay, I'm ready. She kind of had hit her wall. And I said, all right, what's going on? She says, well, I work. I'm a manager at Sears. Remember Sears? I'm a manager at Sears. But I don't go home after my shift is over, because that used to be our time. And so what I do is I drive. I drive and I drive and I drive until it gets dark, and I don't associate the time with dinner time with my husband, because she also had adult children. And I said, okay, so it was working. She says, yeah, but it doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't work. It's not sustainable. She became one of my best volunteers for my spousal loss support group, because she engaged in mourning avoiding behaviors until she realized it wasn't sustainable. We really can't outrun this. So what if we were to say mourning, and I'm taking liberty here and using in fight or flight, I'm going to say fight, but it's not really a fight when you do your mourning. It's really a natural process. Okay? But what I mean by this is you're choosing to stay and engage with grief. And you do this by mourning. So what is mourning? Well, mourning is the expression of grief outside of myself. If I walked in here, I wouldn't necessarily know that you were grievers. Now, maybe somebody's crying, but it could be for any reason. So grief is what I feel inside of me, what I think about it, what I think about. Mourning is how I get through grief by externalizing it outside of myself. It's grief gone public, as Alan Wolfeld says. That's how we get through this process. It's not time. It's how you use the time effectively. So there's a big difference between grieving and mourning. I do a presentation called Are You Grieving or Mourning? And most people think they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So what are these action things that we're talking about? that our society makes it difficult to engage in. This is just a very short list, okay? Talking, crying, writing love letters, poems, journaling, using music, art as a means of expression, moving your body, dance to release, memorial events, items, anything that gives expression to what you're feeling internally. Once had a client who came in all the way from Leamington, and she wasn't a talker and she wasn't a crier. Her husband had died suddenly. And I just felt like I had to be a magician. I didn't know how to engage her at all. Until I found out that she loved writing poems. And she told me she wrote poems about her spouse. So I asked her to bring in a poem the next time she came to see me. And we used that as a way to talk about her grief. So that's how she expressed. She couldn't come in and just chat and tell me what she had done that week or the 2 weeks or how she was feeling. She put pen to paper and then she was able to talk to me about it. I had another client who was a professional violinist, and she would pick up her violin every morning after her husband and 2 children died in a car accident. And she would play the violin every morning. She made that her scheduled grief time. Grief doesn't come on schedule, but she made that her scheduled grief time. As well as the fact that she came for counseling and went into a support group. And what she found over time is that the pieces that she chose to play changed. As her grief lessened, the pieces that she chose to play were lighter, were faster in tempo. It reflected her internal landscape. So, I'm not going to make you a crier. I'm not going to make you a talker. I'm not going to insist if you're a client of mine. But I will definitely encourage you to find your way to externalize. You can use art. I have a client right now who lost an infant, and she says she's an artist, but she doesn't want to go back to painting. But she's doing a pottery class right now. Anything else that you think you can add? Or anything else that you might be doing? Some of you may know that I fell into bereavement work backwards after the stillborn death of my first child. And because I did not have any other children, I had a difficult time believing that I was a mom. I needed to recognize that I was a mom before I expected other people to recognize that I was still a mom. So I wrote my daughter letters. And I signed them, Love, Mom. And that was my conversation with her. And I have a stack of those journals, and that was 26 years ago. I still have them. That was my way. I also went to counseling. I also went to a support group. I had a lot of good people surrounding me. But I also needed something very private that was just mine and hers. So when you talk about your husband or your wife, that there were special times, you'd cuddle on the couch or for breakfast. Well, what would you talk to him or her about? Tell them about your day. And what I'll always hear is, but it makes me cry. Guess what? That's okay. That's okay, because we're getting it out. As you get it out, the easier the journey becomes. I will always carry my grief with me for Hannah. This is my continuing bond with her. I'm not bonded with her out of pain any longer. And that's my wish for all of you, is that you go through this process and that you're connected with your loved one, but not out of pain. But you cannot put the cart before the horse. You've got to go through this process. It's tough. It's not easy. So, mourning transforms acute grief into integrated grief. So what does that mean? I presume all of you are recently bereaved, so you're experiencing acute grief right now. When you do your mourning, when the heart finally gets in line with the head, then that becomes integrated grief. It's part of your life story. It will always be part of your life story, but it isn't something that's necessarily triggering or anything that you're running away from or avoiding. Hopefully you can talk about your loved one without perhaps the emotional response that you might be feeling now, or the avoidance. So guess what? When we think about grief, we think it affects us emotionally, right? But it also affects us, our heads. It affects our bodies. It affects how we interact with people. And it affects us spiritually. Not religion necessarily, but just on a more philosophical kind of spectrum. And we don't know that, do we? We think we can pack grief into 5 neat stages. It doesn't happen that way. With the exception of shock or numbness in this sphere after a loved one's died, even when you're expecting their death, you can basically go wherever your experience. But I can almost guarantee you're going to feel at some level your grief in these 5 domains. So what we're going to do then is we're going to talk about how it affects us in those 5 domains, and then how we're going to look after ourselves in those 5 domains. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go home and figure out what your self-care plan is going to be. Okay? Any questions? Comments? Does anyone want a stretch break? Yes? No? Anyone want to go out there and see what the weather's like? And no? I don't want to suggest anything that's... No? Are we good? Anybody need toilet break? No? All right. Okay, so we'll go on. So let's then look how you're emotionally distressed in grief. Okay? I'm not suggesting you're going to feel all of those things. These are possible responses that you might feel. So with the exception of shock or numbness, which everyone goes through, there is a sense of shock. And that's because nature is protecting you to do the things that you need to do soon after a death. That's how you make major decisions. That's how you make legal decisions, estate decisions. That's how you plan a funeral ritual or a memorial ritual. Because you're really in a state of shock. After that, you can have any one of those experiences, those feelings. Do not prescribe anything for yourself. There's no anger stage. And anger could come in the form of irritability. You could be just angry at the world because your loved one's no longer in it. Or maybe you're not angry. Maybe you're just profoundly sad. So like a list that you get when you get a medication that these might be the side effects, I'd like you to consider the list that I put up there as possible effects of grief. Because I want you to know that if you experience any of these things, guess what? You're normal. And they're not going to last forever if you do your work. C.S. Lewis, after the confirmed bachelor, after he married and lost his wife, in A Grief Observed, he says, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. Just doesn't feel right any longer. Nothing feels right. Nothing feels safe." And if it was a sudden death, you might experience hovering over your loved ones that are still alive. You might have fear that something's going to happen to them. That's coming from deep in the amygdala. You want to protect your loved ones. So, how are you going to look after yourself emotionally then? So what's your self-care plan going to be in the emotional realm? Use any one of these things. Anything where you're giving voice, so to speak, to your emotions, your internal state. And I want to go back to the concept of stages also. With the grief process, we think if we experience bargaining or we experience anger, once we've experienced it, it's over. But actually what happens is we will revisit emotions and feelings until we've done the work around it. So I might have a client saying that they feel very guilty at the beginning of the process, and then midway through the process it comes up again, but it hasn't been an issue in between, and then it changes to regret. So our feelings evolve. Okay? What we want is that by giving it expression, we're softening them. We're not carrying them inside. Because if we carry them inside us, they actually freeze. And then that makes the journey forward all the more difficult. Rain, after all, is just rain. It is not bad weather. So also is pain, is just pain, unless we resist it. Then it becomes torment. You don't have to suffer through this. So, physical. Have a look at this list. Because remember, grief is stress. Stress affects our bodies. Anything look familiar? Experienced it? Yeah. It's going to disrupt your sleep. It has the potential to disrupt your eating patterns. I have clients who forget to eat. Stomach ailments, headaches, backaches, shortness of breath, feeling like something is on my chest. Right? I can't take a breath. My mind won't stop. Because grief is trying to get your attention. And when we started off this night, we talked about how good we are at ignoring it. And I tell you, if you don't deal with it now, it'll keep knocking on the door. So one of the things I recommend to all my clients is that they get a full physical, and I know it's difficult in these last 2 years, but if you can, I'd recommend it, or at least tell your physician or your nurse practitioner that you've experienced this major stressor. Chronic conditions are exacerbated as well. Arthritis, migraines, asthma, anything that was under control, you can see an exacerbation because, again, our heads are connected to our bodies are connected to our heads. But when you do the work of mourning, what we want to see are any type of effects of grief physically, we want to see them softening. But you need to check in with your doctor because that gives you a baseline, because if they don't soften over time, then they have to look at some organic reason. So, how can you look after yourself physically? We all like comfort food, and that's okay. You need comfort right now. But for the most part, if you make healthy choices, I'm not expecting you to eat 3 square meals if you don't have an appetite. I would like you to make healthy choices, nutritional choices. If you do not have to go to work, or you're not responsible for minor children, and you can nap during the day, give yourself permission to do that. Remember we talked about grief, we talked about stress and how it has to be released, expelled from the body. So it affects us physically. We have to move, okay? Through dance or yoga or meditation or stretching. It first of all helps to ward off depression. It helps to clear our minds. Engage in some form of movement, specifically related to your grief. I'm not talking about I clean the house or I walk a lot on my job. I want it specific for you, part of your self-care plan. Drink lots of water, because when we don't drink water, it can contribute to confusion. And that can be frightening, because we'll talk about cognitive effects in a moment. And try to minimize or refrain from any type of mood-altering substances. We cannot medicate grief away. Unless you have some mental health issues which required medication and medical supervision before coming into the grief process, it is not the first order of business. If, however, you're not functioning, or you're crying all the time, you're emotionally dysregulated, you may want to talk to a therapist and or a doctor. But it is not the answer necessarily in grief. Because remember, this is a natural process. Just as an infant has separation anxiety from their caregivers, this is our form of separation anxiety. And we don't medicate children, or we shouldn't, but we soothe them. So we're talking about you trying to find your way to self-soothe yourself. Feelings come and go like clouds in a windy sky. Conscious breathing is my anchor. So whenever you feel dysregulated, whenever you feel the butterflies or the heaviness in your chest, that's your fight or flight response kicking in, and I want you to slow it down by doing your deep breathing. Anchor yourself, ground yourself. Tell yourself you can get through this moment. I remember telling myself that initially after we lost Hannah. If I can get up and go and brush my teeth, and then go and make a sandwich, That's how I broke it down. Moment by moment living. I can get through this moment. I didn't allow myself to think too far in the future because that was too overwhelming. So when you find your mind racing, bring it back to now. I can get through this moment. And then I can get through the next moment. And then you find you're going to string a whole bunch of moments together. And then a whole bunch of days, and then a whole bunch of weeks. This is very, very frightening because we put so much emphasis on keeping it together. But when we're emotionally dysregulated, it takes our thinking offline. We don't have the capacity to think as clearly. So, when we're grieving acutely, we may experience difficulty with focus and concentration. You may be forgetful. You might not have motivation, even to do the things you enjoyed doing previously. That's frightening. Disorganized, confused. Can give me a timeline for when your loved one died. Difficult to make a decision. That's okay. You're not losing control of your mental capacities. As we get our emotions regulated, this all comes back online. So, do whatever you need to do to help yourself through this. And don't add any more stress by becoming upset at yourself. I love this one. I was never insane except upon occasion when my heart was touched. Love isn't about the head. It's all about the heart, and the heart is very illogical. Right? We fall in love. So, how are you going to look after yourself cognitively? You're going to make lists and lists and lists and more lists. Then if they're, put them in your phone, put them on sticky notes, just make sure you don't lose them. End each day with a list. What have you accomplished? Because sometimes it might feel like you've done nothing. Some people thrive on lists. But not everything can get done. Because remember, you're not operating at 100%. So you've got to be very gentle with yourself. Do not make any major decisions. Why do we say that? I've said it a few times tonight.
It will follow you.
What's that?
It will follow you.
It will follow you, yes. Yes, it will definitely fall. But the reason not to make any major decisions, you're not thinking. Exactly. Because you're driven by your heart. You're driven by your fight or flight response. I got to get away from this. I got to get rid of their car. I got to get rid of their clothing. It hurts too much. Remember, anything that you dispose of in haste, you can't get back. So don't make any major decisions. Yes. Because you will regret them. Keep things simple. Keep it simple. Bring it down to basics. This is not the rest of your life. This is just now. It will help you to get through this so that you can go on. And learn as much as you can about grief. If you can concentrate and you can read, pick up some books. You can, certainly engage in support groups online. But I would caution you though with any groups that are not monitored by a professional. So remember that, okay? Because if it's a self-help group, you may hear a lot about it never gets better. or you have to keep busy. So just keep that in mind. If you can find an online group that is monitored, is moderated by a professional, that's much better. Understand that you've got limits. Just like when we get tired, we rest. Understand when you've hit your limit. I can't take any more of this. You know, I'm not able to think, or I'm not able to process. I need the meeting to end, or I can't continue this conversation any longer. I will not make any major decisions for the first year unless doing so is absolutely unavoidable. And I will not worry about my inability to make lesser decisions. It may take a little longer than I expect, but it is all part of the grieving process. My uncertainty and instability are only temporary. I have a very close friend whose husband died unexpectedly about 5 weeks ago. And we made some plans, and she called me and said, "I'm so sorry, I have a previous engagement on the same day." And she says, she apologized for her scatterbrain, and I said, "No, you got grief brain. That's all. You've just got grief brain." Because our heads and our hearts are so focused on how our life has changed, it has no time for frivolous things. Did I pay that bill? Right? When did I make that dentist appointment for? Those things aren't important at this moment. I'm really truly amazed. In the 25 years I've been working with the bereaved, I'm amazed that only a handful of people have forgotten appointments with me. Or got the days confused. Because it's a grief effect. So be gentle with yourself. Don't add any more stress to the stress that grief is already bringing you. So socially, have you experienced any of these things? Sometimes it feels like we're here, but we're not here. Like you're speaking a different language, even with your closest friends, even maybe with family members. It can be very frustrating. And speaking of family, if you think of family, the members of a family as part of the system, right? The family system. Well, they're all going to be grieving slightly differently. Because as you said, your kids are grieving their dad, you're grieving your life partner. And your children are going to be grieving different relationships with dad. So one of the things to remember in a family is to respect everybody else's grieving process and not impose anything on them. So we can be highly sensitive. Things that didn't bother us before just get us. People think that if you invited out to a barbecue party, it'll be good for you. But maybe you don't feel like going. But as I said, for every one invitation you turn down, consider accepting the next one. Doesn't mean you have to stay for the whole event. Go until you reach your limit and then say goodbye. Grief, life. Grief, life. Okay? But you have to be okay with saying no. You have to be okay with saying not today, maybe next time. Thank you for thinking of me. I'll come for long as I can. And again, these things don't last forever either. And you may, Alan Wolfelt has the rule of thirds. He says 1/3 of the people that you know will walk with you through grief. They'll be there for you no matter what. They'll sit and hold your hand. They'll laugh with you. They'll cry with you. They won't judge you. 1/3 of the people will push and pull you through the grief process. Keep busy. How you doing? Are you over it yet? And 1/3 of the people will be neutral, or they'll disappear from your life. So going forward, I'd like you to try to figure out loosely the people in your life. What group do they belong in? You might find family members in groups 2 and 3. And I'm not suggesting you burn any fences, but I am suggesting you practice self-care and maybe a little bit of distancing for now. Figure out who's in your good 1/3 and keep close to them. These are the people that are in your lifeboat. Figure out who's in your lifeboat. Who do you want in your lifeboat? Who are you going to count on? Do not be afraid to accept offers, and please don't be afraid to ask. You'll find out who's in your good 1/3 when you ask. You can be in a room full of people, and guess what? Feel really lonely, right? Because that one person isn't there. So how are you going to look after yourself? You're going to figure out who's in your good 1/3. You're going to try and distance yourself. You're going to practice saying no from the people that are insensitive or hurtful. And I really do believe that most people don't intend to hurt you or harm you. Accept invitations. Okay? Because you still want to be connected. Because those invitations will stop if you keep saying no. And be okay with no. Not today, not this time. Can I think about it? Can I get back to you? When's the very latest I can let you know? And every so often you need to step outside of your comfort zone as well. Because if you don't, the first time, whenever that's going to be, it's going to be much more difficult. So test yourself every so often. But your self-care plan socially also has to be balanced with your alone time as well. Because ultimately this is a journey of the heart and soul. And while you need people to get through it, you're doing the heavy lifting. Don't assume, ask, be kind, tell the truth. Don't say anything you can't stand fully behind. Have integrity. Tell people how you feel. I remember soon after we lost Hannah, and this was, I would say she's an acquaintance. She was really trying to be supportive, and she was filling in time. Do you notice how we're uncomfortable with silence? Right? In grief work, we call that sacred silence. Silence is okay. But this lady was rambling on in her need to want to support me, and she started talking about one of her teenage daughters who had terminated a pregnancy. I said, I really can't hear that right now. I really can't hear that story. So figure out ways to be kind, but to get your needs met. I really must go. I can't engage in this conversation. Or as Alan Wolfelt says, you say things like true but not helpful. So when someone says, well, at least you have your memories, you go, true, but not helpful right now. So depending on your personality, right, that might not work with some people. When I've suggested it to some clients, I go, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. They're in a better place. Well, actually, a better place would be here with me. Right? It's all for the better. I'm not so sure about that right now. No one's going to look after yourself unless you do. And we teach people how to treat us. So the last realm is spiritual. Again, not religious, but if you happen to follow organized religion, but I'm talking more in terms of general outlook in life. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Why me? Why right now? Now what do I do? What meaning do I have in life? What's my purpose? Because I was supposed to be married forever, right? I was supposed to have a child until they were ready to leave home. This wasn't part of our plan. What did I do to deserve it? So what you need to do is you need to explore those things. It's okay to ask those questions. Because again, if you keep it inside, they will fester. And if you do have a higher power, you may be questioning it right now. Has God abandoned me? Has my higher power forgotten me? Explore it. Death comes, when death comes, life is examined. So true. So how are you going to look after yourself spiritually? Protest the death. Say you're angry. Say you're upset. While everyone around you might be telling you it's for the best. Make use of rituals. Okay, whatever those rituals are, whether it's something online or something more traditional, whether it be a celebration of life, whether it be a memorial bench, whatever speaks to you. This is your grief journey. Reflect, pray, meditate. If you're able to express your sadness at the same time you're able to express gratitude for you still have in your life, then you have just increased your chances of having a good grief outcome. I'm not saying you can't be sad, but sad and being grateful can be held in the same space. We can't be sad and happy at the same time. Those are different sides of the same coin. But you can certainly be profoundly sad and still say that you can find things in your life to be grateful for. And if I'm working with a client and they can tell me that they still have gratitude, that's hopeful. So, it might be difficult to think of what you're grateful for, but you can start off with very basics. I have a roof over my head. I have food on the table. I have loved ones who still care for me. It helps to balance the sadness. So, as we end the presentation with one last slide, I just want you to remember, that this is your grief journey. This is nobody else's. And if you don't come up with a self-care plan to fully mourn your loved one, you will find this journey much more difficult than it needs to be. So you are important enough. Disregard other people's society's expectations of what you need to be doing. Disregard timelines. As long as you're moving one step forward, it might not feel like it. Write your own script, because this is your life. And we'll end with this. If your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. So take whatever you get, you can glean from tonight's presentation, and come up with your own self-care plan. And I'm sure no two are going to look alike, and they shouldn't. Any questions, any comments? Would you like me to review anything? Explain, expand? As clear as mud, I know. All of these presentations that's being streamed right now on the Families First Grieving Hearts YouTube channel are archived, so you can certainly go back and look it over again. Feel free to share it with other people if you see fit. I also want to share that we have pamphlets available for you if you're interested, from a new charitable organization that's specifically for grief called Julian's House. Has anyone heard of Julian? You've heard of Julian's House? Okay, wonderful. Yes, I see some nods. A little aside, I'm very proud of it because I was one of the founding members of Julian's House. I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of it. Very proud. We've hired our first ED and program coordinator. Right now, it is just offered online, but it is thriving. They have support groups, and if you go onto the website, you'll see why it's named Julian's House. It was named after a young 18-year-old boy who was tragically killed. And so this is another resource for you in the community. They offer the support groups as well as what they call restorative programs, which is an opportunity to get together with other people that are grieving, but not necessarily focus on grief. So anything that might include art or meditation or yoga. And it was the brainchild of myself and my former partner who had done bereavement work, and we realized that there was a need for more services for the bereaved in the community. It's not meant to replace therapy or counseling, but it's certainly an adjunct for anyone in the community. So we've got some pamphlets outside in the hallway, and I've got some here as well. Okay? So take advantage of whatever's out there in the community. As you know, Windsor-Essex County is a very, very compassionate community, and we're a small town, and we want to take care of each other. So we continue to offer these presentations here. We do take a hiatus in July and August, and then we're back up again in September. Okay? So I'd like you all to take care and to put yourself first. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming out. Did you have a question, sir?